Good morning, good afternoon, or evening, depending on where on the globe you're calling in from. My name is Zsuzsanna Hollander, and I'm the Director of Data Science at Genome British Columbia. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to recognize and acknowledge that I live, work, and raise my family in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, which is on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Welcome to Genome BC's Data Literacy webinar series. We started this 2 years ago with the aim to bring national and international experts together to help deepen our understanding of different data-related initiatives, standards, and resources. Each of our webinars is recorded and available to view on Genome BC's YouTube channel. In today's presentation, Dr. Tim Hubbard, the recently appointed director of ELIXIR, will talk about Europe's premier intergovernmental organization dedicated to advancing life sciences through bioinformatics infrastructure. As I was trying to learn more about Tim, I found out he did some pretty cool things even at the beginning of his career. During his postdoctoral fellowship in Japan, he worked on protein folding. Following that, in 1994, he co-founded SCOPE, which stands for the Structural Classification of Proteins database. This was the first biological database designed from the start to take advantage of the then new World Wide Web. How cool is that? A few years later, he joined the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute to become head of human genome analysis. He was also a senior advisor at Genomics England and an associate director at Health Data Research UK. He is currently professor of bioinformatics at King's College London. And while I would love to chat about all these amazing projects he has worked on throughout his career, today we will focus on ELIXIR. Tim, with this, I'll hand this over.
Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me to give this. I'm very new as the director of ELIXIR, but I'm going to try and walk you through this quite complicated structure that's been built up by the former director and the staff of about 40 or 50 staff at ELIXIR and a network of researchers across Europe over the last 10 years. I'll give you an idea of what ELIXIR covers and where it's going. Okay, right. So what is ELIXIR? So firstly, it's an intergovernmental organization with currently 21 member states, and then one additional member, which is the EMBL, particularly EBI, with a number of observers. So it operates as this structure through a treaty to bring together different groups of researchers across Europe into a single coordinated entity. Why do we need something like ELIXIR? Well, so I'm just making that go. This is about the size of biological data these days. Managing and sustaining this is very important for research, but not very easy to accomplish, especially when it's distributed across many countries, many institutions, and particularly standards interoperability are difficult to achieve unless you've got all these different groups working together. You also need sustainability. And so coordinating this, obviously the European Union has funding structures that work across member states. So having this coordination allows us to align resources, bid collectively for joined up components of infrastructure. So ELIXIR provides this coordination glue to connect together all these life science components and to build towards a single infrastructure that interoperates, supporting data, knowledge exchange, and collaborations. So that's what we try and bring together in the ELIXIR structure. And this is not going forward. We are. And so the way it's arranged is you have these ELIXIR nodes, a node in every country that's a member of ELIXIR, and these vary in size depending on the maturity of each country's bioinformatics infrastructure. Those nodes consist of many institutions in each country. So although there's 21 country nodes, there's about 250 institutes that are involved across Europe. The hub acts as a coordinator. It doesn't hold data. It coordinates the activities of the nodes, and within them, the different institutions that are providing different services. So variable size and maturity, and of course, each country may have scientific focus around particular areas. So nodes may have particular specialities in terms of the science that they're interested in. Now, the structure within this is organized around areas of activity, which we term as platforms, referring to compute that you need to have coordinated so that you can do analysis, the way that data is handled, the interoperability of data and components and resources, a variety of tools, and then training infrastructure. Now, it's a large community of individuals that drive the creation of all these components and standards and services. And so those communities are quite critical and have been built up. And they're part of a kind of network of expert groups. We have more junior organizations called focus groups working towards perhaps becoming a community. And then the platforms themselves actually doing some of the coordination of development. Now, the ELIXIR structure has gone now through, it's 10 years old, I said, 2 5-year plans so far. This is the third 5-year plan, which has just started. And so the structure that's being used here is to have a set of scientific priority areas. And these are cell and molecular research, biodiversity, food security and pathogens, and human data and translational research. Biodiversity, food security and pathogens is a kind of new priority area, although there was quite a lot of research previously done in previous 5-year plans, but it's got a particular structure here. Then there's technology, which is particularly worrying about the future of federating data together. So data is stored in many places. Data is now too large to move or can't be moved for different reasons, such as privacy. So if you want to support analysis in the life sciences, you need to start thinking about how to support federated data analysis. And I'll come back later to a bit more about that. And then the maturity of this network, the nodes, operating a node, nodes have become more mature. They are like a mini ELIXIR, each of them when they're large, because it means coordinating activities across quite a large number of institutes in a particular country and spreading ideas like FAIR across that country. So there's a lot of activity in this program around node development and also supporting people, because of course the capacity that we have within each country, a lot of that depends on training of individuals to support this activity around bioinformatics. So if you want to read more about this program, and you can read about previous programs, there's a set of documents which you can download. There are links on this. I assume this is going to get distributed, so you can get the links from that. Now, how do we actually go about developing individual components or particular activities? A lot of this is done through what's called commission services. So the structure of having 21 member states is that each member state, as well as setting up a node in their country, they pay a fee based on GDP to the ELIXIR hub. That pays in part for the staff that act here as coordinators, but it also provides a fraction of income that we can then redistribute in a coordinated way to have different groups, different nodes, and individual institutes within those nodes work on very specific projects. There's a large number of those small commission services, and they're really meant to be glue to get different groups developing components together or developing plans for components, because a lot of resources need larger amounts of money, but the commission services could lead to for a community, for example, to bid for a large EU project. And I'll mention some of those later on. But these commission services, which of course have been running over this period of time, have now generated quite a lot of different outputs. The latest set of commission services were a set of calls in the 3 scientific areas. We've awarded 1.6 million in this particular batch across these 3 scientific areas. And those are actually mainly focused on getting coordination between different communities within these 3 theme areas. So what have been generated over this period of time that's actually outputs that can be used by the community? So there's a set of guidelines, there's a set of web portals, there's a set of services, and then there's other supporting activities such as working with industry. There's a whole engagement framework. We have an industry advisory group, as well as within various nodes, the specific interactions with industry. So to give you some idea of these sorts of resources, so service collections. So it's hard as bioinformaticians to navigate a very large space of resources, databases, etc. So ELIXIR does some of that navigating for you in labeling core data resources, deposition databases, and recommended interoperability resources, such as supporting fair research. So these are places where you can go and get robust guidance or robust tools that have already been assessed under the ELIXIR framework. And here are a few examples. There's training platform, there's biocontainers, which contain standardized software resources, biotools, which is a registry of tools. And then there's actual pieces of infrastructure, such as the Life Science Login, which is an authentication service, which many, many resources use. So you can get a single ID as a researcher, and that enables you to log into a very large number of different resources. The examples of a lot of managing data is around good practices towards fair, what you need to do in order to make your data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and the general processes that you need to adopt if you're going to manage the life science, the life cycle of data. So there's a set of resources to act as guidance for individuals working with resources, trying to make them available. Similarly, there's a training platform which has a very large number of training materials, sets of events, and this can all be accessed freely from these links here. Some of those are, of course, coming from Canada. So there's already engagement with Canada in various ELIXIR activities, and I'll come back to some of those later on. This whole infrastructure is primarily, at least as a starting point, based on open data and openness in general in terms of these resources being available. And in surveys that have been carried out by ELIXIR, it's clear that this is regarded as very important, not just by normal researchers, but also by SMEs and industry in general, that having these resources that can be freely accessed is a key underpinning for innovation and activity. Now, I mentioned before that ELIXIR actively participates in big EU projects. A lot of those are coordinated through our communities, working together, possibly with some initial work through commission services to bid for much larger projects. And I'm just going to give some examples on that. One particular one that's just finished is the BiCovid, which was, of course, coordinating a lot of the data that was being collected around the world, but particularly around Europe, around the COVID epidemic. One which is working now is the European Genome Data Infrastructure, and that's towards human whole genome data across Europe, the coordination necessary for that. That really comes out of something called the 1+ Million Genomes Initiative, which is a treaty that was actually, which was signed by a number of countries with the aim of progressing towards interoperable genome resources for research and towards healthcare across Europe. So having signed that initiative a number of years ago, there's a question of how do you implement this? And there've been a number of particular commission-funded activities. There's Beyond 1 Million Genomes project setting out a lot of the landscape for processing this. But in terms of actually having infrastructure to handle genomes in not only a large-scale way, but a distributed way, there's the Genome Data Infrastructure project, which is a 40 million euro project funded by the Commission, coordinated by ELIXIR, as it was the B1MG project coordinated by ELIXIR. So this is a project in progress to build infrastructure, deploy it across member states who are part of the 1+MG project, and have that move towards a federated structure. Now, there's quite a lot of federated activity already. There's the FEGA, which was developed by EMBL, EBI, and has been deployed in coordination with ELIXIR and already being used in a federated way with this login authentication process that already exists that I mentioned before. But this is human data. So we're moving here towards large-scale use of human data, large-scale coordination, data collection, interoperability. But human data isn't the only thing that we have to worry about. There's a large number of societal challenges across the biosphere. And if you look at all these areas which are of concern, they all are being addressed partly through data-driven solutions. So there's a much more general need to be able to handle data on a large scale in a distributed way with federated analysis. And you can see the kinds of problems that we have in dealing with this, not just data growth and diversity and a distributed location, but also these newer issues such as data sensitivity, which doesn't just affect human data, which is obviously very sensitive, but it also affects data that's being collected for other societal reasons where there's issues of national sovereignty, where countries don't want to distribute data, but might be prepared to provide access to it in a federated way. And the current debate, of course, is AI. What impact is that going to make? How do we make data available for artificial intelligence research in a way that allows that kind of AI learning to take place effectively? The European Union is kind of coordinating towards this sort of framework through something called the European data spaces. So in the health space, there's GDI for genomics, ECAM for cancer images, but much more broadly, the plan for the European health data space, which would cover all health records. All of these are towards the idea that not only would you enable research access to a very large number of genomes, particularly as these get integrated into the health systems of Europe, but corresponding other health data. But all has to be done in a secure way. Similarly, in other spaces, such as Green Deal, there's another data space being planned there. So there's about 15 data spaces that are being planned for different purposes across the European Union. And so many of those will be in the biological space, and ELIXIR structures, if we can make federated interoperable support for analysis work well, then it provides a general way of addressing this kind of large-scale analytics. Finally, I'm going to talk a bit about international beyond this. So we'd like to obviously scale up access to the resources, make them more widely known about globally. Also, of course, promote global standards. A lot of this work underpinning this is based on existing global standards, making sure that the distributed nature of ELIXIR doesn't, aligns as wherever possible to common global standards. We'd also like to expand international collaborations with other countries outside the groups that are member states in the European Union. And there's quite an increase in awareness of multilateral organizations of ELIXIR, such as OECD or UN, and we'd like to be seen as this trusted partner in this global enterprise of handling large-scale data. So there's quite a lot of existing international collaborations beyond the structure of the 21 members. We have collaborations with the Australian Biocommons, and those sort of mechanisms involve staff exchanges and travel grants and sessions at international conferences. For that particular purpose, we extended the collaboration officially in 2013 with specific interactions around the different platforms that ELIXIR has been developing. Recently, we've signed a memorandum of understanding with the NIH, and there's already been work together with the NIH, but this is to put this into a common framework and build relationships and technical knowledge exchange across the whole of the NIH structure. ELIXIR in Canada has had engagement through EU-funded projects. Canada's, of course, associated with Horizon Europe. And so there's lots of opportunities to carry out collaborations with individual ELIXIR nodes and more broadly across ELIXIR. There's particular plans for engagement with the next science program, as associate status to continue that. Of course, ELIXIR has also got collaborations with international organizations such as GA4GH. There's a partnership agreement there. And of course, everything involving genomes in the human space, a lot of the standards come from GA4GH, and ELIXIR works to spread those across its own structure. So the other sort of interesting thing about Canadian involvement is that there's a lot of Canadians on the Scientific Advisory Board, both currently and previously. So we're very grateful to their expertise and advice and contributions to ELIXIR through that mechanism. And there is actually some engagement in some components which are deployed not just in ELIXIR, but also in Canada. Beacon is a very good example. It's not quite federated analysis, but it allows federated querying of different resources. If you've set up a beacon on your genome data set, then you can carry out this anonymized query and discover if a particular variant is in a range of different data sets. Canada has a number of these beacons deployed, which are part of this international beacon network. So most recently, there's been some political visits. We had a visit from the Deputy Minister of Health before I started, and Councillor and High Commissioner of Data. So there have been discussions during the pandemic and on health data with Canadian representatives. So there's lots of opportunities for future collaboration, staff exchanges, just as we've done with Australia and Brazil, and are planning partly with the NIH with the new MOU there. So I think that's all I want to cover. And I'll stay around for questions. If you want to follow more about ELIXIR, then there's lots of different routes for that. There's a lot of webinars and events that you can access, and follow us on LinkedIn, where things are posted quite regularly, as well as Twitter. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Tim. It was actually a really good overview. I've learned quite a bit about it. And one of the things that caught my eye was the 1+million genomes initiative. So I wasn't aware of that. It's really good to see that work is being done in that area. I'm not sure if you're aware that there was this Pan-Canadian Genomics Library that was funded just last year in Canada, that will house a lot of the human and potentially non-human whole genome sequencing data, and perhaps some collaboration with some of the 1+million genomes related initiatives would be quite good in that respect as well.
Yeah, so I think then the 1+mg, because it's going to be distributed, I mean, at the moment, there's actually a project which is just starting called Genomes of Europe, which will basically collect genomes for quite a few cohorts across European countries in that consortium. So the system will get populated with a large number of genomes, kind of as a forerunner for, eventually genomes being collected in health systems, as they had been in the UK in Genomics England. But the aim, I think, in some ways, what we did in Genomics England was easier because there's no federation required. There's just a single location for a collection of genomes. Across the 1+mg, we're going to have to make federation work, because not only is too much data to move around, but national jurisdictions are going to come into play. I think if you've got cohort which is consented, then it's relatively easy to get permission to move data around. But once it becomes connected to health systems, then I think countries will want to may provide access, but they'll want to keep the actual data located locally. And so federation has to be made to work. And there's a lot of activity connected with ELIXIR. There's this specific project, which I didn't talk about, called EOSCIN Trust, which is all around federated approaches to analysis and the underpinning components of infrastructure you need to support that.
And from what I understand, for the Pan-Canadian Genomics Library, their idea was also to go with the federated approach, to have data in the different provinces.
Yeah.
It makes sense. Obviously, it's going to be interesting because there is the federated analysis, but how much of the clinical data and how it's going to be shared, how the linkages are going to be done. So I'm quite excited to see how all of that is going to be evolving on the human side. And in some ways,
the critical thing will be,
it's not just human, right?
Yeah, the critical thing for that will be that we operate interoperable federation technologies, that if we develop them independently and they don't interoperate, then you'll be stuck with doing federated analysis across your own collection of genomes only.
Yes. So there was a question, I think somewhat answered, is only human data federated?
I mean, I think at the moment the data that's being, this is largely because human data is obviously sensitive. And so the need for a federated approach is much, much clearer at the moment. But you see other data sets, pandemic genomes have been shared, but there's been quite a lot of sensitivity around that. And in the future, it may be also, just for practical purposes, a federated structure there might be easier to operate. There are other collections where countries are sensitive about data moving around. Some of this becomes, if data is too large, it may be just too hard, too difficult to move it.
Mm-hmm.
In other cases, it may be for different sensitivities. But once you've developed federation technology, and there are specific generic components such as arrow crates, the idea that you can package an algorithm with all the extra metadata information you need and distribute that and run it on cloud-based orchestration attached to data sets in different places and then combine the results. Those kind of very generic ways of deploying bioinformatics components should be applicable to many, many different types of data.
So one question relates to how do countries get credit for the data they share?
Well, so I think that is exactly where you collide with this, the open sharing idea, breaks down when the data is too big, and it also breaks down when countries want to gain some return for that. And so, of course, if you have a federated structure where you can't download the data, but you can do analysis, then, countries could decide to, have some terms and conditions associated with being able to run algorithms on their systems. I mean, ideally, we'd like data just to be open, but, I think you have to recognize that that's sensitive for different situations.
Yeah, and one of the sensitivities in Canada and some other parts of the world is related to indigenous people rights.
Yes, yes.
So there, for sure, the open data is not an option, and so there has to be some kind of mechanism for access control as well.
Yeah, so I might point out there actually that one of my other roles is I'm on the technical advisory group for genomics at the World Health Organization. And there is a principles document, which it was distributed in draft form for comments a couple of months ago. It's being finalized now, and it tries to set out kind of guidelines for the world around these classes of data and how, things the countries should think about in terms of enabling, of sharing, enabling the collective benefits from being able to analyze that while respecting things like indigenous populations and different sensitivities connected with genomics data. And that's part of a broad program at WHO to basically as WHO does, provide global guidance for the whole world, in recognizing that this is an important direction for healthcare, but that there are issues that need to be considered.
Yeah, so hopefully that guidance is going to be coming to us, and we'll be looking forward to seeing it. There is another question. Are there plans to collaborate with Canadian institutions on training initiatives to build capacity in data management and bioinformatics?
So I think Francis has put in the Q&A, pointing out that there is already collaboration going on with ELIXIR on TESS, the platform, and I mentioned that there are Canadian contributions to that in that platform, so that there's already collaboration going on there.
Another question was, can you comment on timelines for navigating data access, perhaps by providing an example or examples of more versus less sensitive data needs?
So obviously, data which isn't sensitive, the general principle across the space, biodiversity data, reference data, is that it's just freely available. Of course, ELIXIR only coordinates. The heavy lifting is done, by different nodes, and particularly the EBI node, which of course is by far the biggest in terms of databases. And that data is freely available. But in terms of, when data is sensitive, sometimes it's accessed through things like the European Genome Archive, where you have to get approval to do downloads. In cases we're moving towards of these secure environments, such as operated in the UK by Genomics England and such as planned for the European health data space. And I think for the 1+MG project, where you won't be able to download the data, you'll be able to do analysis across it, particularly if it's come from healthcare. The question then is, can you orchestrate things so that the process for getting access is streamlined? So particularly if you've got to data's in 21 countries. So the European Union is thinking about this, but actually the GDI project has already demonstrated, an actual sort of infrastructure underneath where you would identify yourself through the life science login, but then make an application to do a particular piece of research, and that will be distributed and approved, and you get granted access to run your algorithm against these different data sets. So that sort of orchestration is going to be one of the ways of streamlining this, meaning that you don't have to, as a researcher, have an idea and then have to wait for very long periods of time to be able to do some analysis.
Yeah, sounds really good. Another question is around what opportunities does ELIXIR provide for Canadian researchers to participate in and benefit from European data infrastructures, especially in terms of data access, computational resources, and training? The training, I guess, was mentioned already.
Yeah, so I mean, the resources coordinated by ELIXIR, when they're things like training materials, fair documentation, the web resources, portals that allow you to identify resources that have been identified by us, that's all freely accessible. When it comes to actual computational infrastructure, quite a lot of those are free to anybody. But when we get to a point of cloud access, those may be nationally operated and they may be restricted to people funded from that country. And that's a network effect, and how that's addressed, I think countries may have different funding arrangements for third parties when people want to do heavy computation on a data set that can't be moved.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you want to work with European data, would it be possible to use ELIXIR Federation for that?
Sorry, what did you say? If you want to do computational analysis?
If you want to work with European data, would it be possible to use ELIXIR?
Well, in future, I mean, the GDI project is running now. It's not complete. It's a work in progress. It's got a couple of years to run. But the idea is that it will, at the end of this project, there will be, a minimum viable product in terms of being able to run analysis in a federated way across these infrastructures.
Right. How do you interface with bioinformatics service providers? Is it a marketplace model where there may be various providers offering similar services?
So there are ELIXIR, part of the process of labeling resources. There is a process for doing that, identifying resources that are robust, well run, sustainable, and tools which carry out particular actions. There is a sort of labeling process for that, to improve discoverability of different tools and different resources. So that's part of the sort of ELIXIR nodes and its community's activities, is to try and make the space more navigatable, partly by just connectivity, web infrastructure, partly through annotation of resources.
All right, so this is an interesting question. What types of ethics approval need to be in place in order to access data? Because yeah.
Well, that depends on the data. As I said, that remember that ELIXIR covers all of biology. Quite a lot of these questions seem to be focused around human sensitive data, but the largest set of data is just freely accessible through resources such as EBI repositories and tools based on that. It's only, recent data sets which are, connected with human populations that are restricted.
Are others using the ELIXIR model to share data? Do you teach them how?
So that's, part of a lot of these resources around how to, approaches for considering whether your data can be classed as fair and the ways for managing data in a sustainable way. Those are the kind of guidance documents that, are freely available to try and help with that process anywhere in the world. I think FAIR has been, great success as being a framework for consideration of whether your data, meets that criteria. And it's only partially implemented. Even, remember, ELIXIR is a set of 21 country nodes, and each node has a set of institutes. But that doesn't mean to say all institutes in any particular country that are doing bioinformatics are part of that network. Nodes have been growing, but to have countrywide implementation of something like FAIR, UK is actually just about to try that because there's been a block of funding, BioFair, allocated in the UK associated with ELIXIR, but separate in the sense that it's a national project. But the idea is to try and move to a point of FAIR everywhere in terms of data. FAIR, of course, is compatible with data that's got restrictions on its use and maybe sits in a secure environment. That can still be fair if you do things right.
Yeah.
So the process of verification of data is a work in progress by many means.
Yes, actually, our very first webinar in the series was with Mark Wilkinson talking about the FAIR guiding principles. And one of the things he was mentioning, there is so many tools that are testing whether your data is fair, and they give you not the same results. And so there is still quite a bit of work to be done in how people understand even verification. So one of the things that we are, I guess, struggling with in some ways in the data access community is the siloed health data being integrated. And once it's integrated, how do you access it? And I'm talking human health data in this case. And so even when there are tools through which you could access this sort of integrated health data, it takes quite a bit of time until the approvals are done by each of the data holders, so that you actually get access granted to this. So how long, days or weeks, does it take to get approvals through ELIXIR? Hopefully not as complicated as it is for us.
As I said, ELIXIR is coordinating GDI. GDI is a big EU project which is in progress. And that's part of the larger data spaces project, really, of the EU, one of those data spaces being in health. So the idea, one of the things when it comes to the European health data space, which deals with health records, is that it's a legal framework, a regulation that is going to have to be applied across all member states, and that provides mechanisms to establish national oversight bodies. So, part of the framework is around governance. That's not ELIXIR, that's part of the European health data space, although we're connected with that activity. So, in terms of ELIXIR, the GDI project can try and produce streamlined infrastructure so that you can make an application that can be distributed to the different approval nodes in different countries, but it still relies on those nodes, and they haven't been set up yet, basically.
So I guess as we have learned that creating these large language models with the way AI has been progressing, the carbon footprint has been quite extensive. I'm assuming ELIXIR is not quite as big, but the question was, how big is it?
So, of course, as I said, ELIXIR is coordinating activities across its nodes. ELIXIR, the hub, we don't hold any data. We're just coordinators. Yeah. But we're very aware of the environmental questions. And so part of the training and encouragement is around being able to measure footprints, produce training around, improving the types of algorithms. There's definite things you can do, improving algorithms to reduce your carbon footprint, your compute footprint. We had a discussion at the European Computational Biology meeting, ECCB, just last week, around metrics for measuring the impact of data centers, for example. But those, of course, are national deployments. So quite a lot of this is around encouraging not just standards, but also transparency and comparability, so that you can try and optimize, and certainly move country infrastructures towards a more environmentally sustainable framework.
One last question from the audience was, what advice would you give to someone looking to start this model in their region?
I think there's actually quite a lot of bioinformatics. One of the nice things about it is that you can be a person, with a computer, and you can access through the internet vast amounts of materials around the world in terms of training. And of course, a lot of the code, one of the principles of ELIXIR is to do things with open source. So, a lot of the components are out there, and you can play around with them with relatively few resources and get started that way. Of course, if you're going to do data collection, you're going to need national funding, but there is opportunities to bootstrap, I think, from the resources that are freely available.
And I have a question that's, you mentioned some of the themes of funding that you had. And so I was wondering, how do you decide on what the theme should be? Is it based on, the consortia, what their interests are? What do you see as sort of high level needs within Europe?
So there's, we have a large number of different stakeholders. Obviously, there's the heads of nodes of our members. There's the funders, the national governments. There's the EU work plans, which are supporting particular initiatives. And then there's the scientists who are pushing for certain things to be developed, or they're working in particular areas. So there's lots and lots of different contributions to the where future work should be directed. I should say that ELIXIR is just one of the sets of infrastructures that have been developed in Europe under the S3 framework, the European Strategic Forum for Research Infrastructures. There's quite a few of those. ELIXIR was one of the first biological infrastructures. There were 6 formed initially as a framework in 2007, 8, something like that. The first work towards developing those infrastructures. There's more now, and there is coordination across those infrastructures. They vary. ELIXIR is the infrastructure for data organization, but there are other infrastructures such as Eurobioimaging, coordinating technologies for collecting images. There's BBMRI, which is an infrastructure for bioresources samples, which obviously these are closely related. There are others, there's a whole group of them. And we have regular monthly meetings of that group to coordinate where possible. So ELIXIR is coordinating data But of course, data is just part of the whole process of, the direction of science, what data can be collected, what experiments are useful to collect data from.
I think, actually, there is one last question that popped up. Where do you expect to see biggest changes for ELIXIR Europe in the next few years? Technology, regulation, international coordination?
So, as I mentioned, there are these societal challenges, and we've seen this during COVID as just an example of the power of data to not only inform research but also inform policy. Data collection, societal data collection, I would say data collection is easier than it used to be, but many times those data sources aren't accessible to researchers. Researchers have lived in a world where they got funding to collect data themselves, and then that world has moved towards a fair structure of sharing that data, but it hasn't had access to data collected for societal purposes, for pandemic monitoring or biodiversity monitoring by government departments or health systems. Now, you can see the European Union is recognizing this with these data spaces. So I think one of the big directions of change is to align the research world, which collects data under its own funding, with the societal data world, where the data is more difficult to get access to, but is complementary. And of course, somebody else has already paid for it. It's already been collected. And when you think of health data, you can only afford to collect research funding a small number of individuals. If you can integrate with health systems, you're talking about all individuals. And as long as you can do it correctly in a secure, sensitive way. So the opportunities, that's definitely one of the opportunities, is alignment with these other data sets.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And thank you for giving us a really good overview of the complexities, but also the opportunities coming from ELIXIR. We're looking forward to seeing how everything is going to be moving along your under your directorship, and we're looking forward to seeing what happens and how we as Canada can learn from it and work with you in collaboration. Thank you so much for your time, Tim. And
thanks very much for having me. Yep. Thank you.